We are plunging into the skies over Vietnam, focusing on a jet fighter that, by the mid-1960s, was already considered a bit of a relic. The Soviet-made Mikoyan-Gorovich MiG-17.
It really is, one of the most compelling studies in asymmetric warfare we have in aviation history. The MiG-17, I mean, this was an aircraft the Soviet Union had already kind of moved past, yet it became the absolute backbone of North Vietnam's air defense.
Right.
So our mission today is to unpack the source material and understand exactly how this supposedly obsolete, nimble little interceptor managed to challenge and frankly survive against the massive technological and numerical superiority of U.S. air power for nearly a decade.
And that opening story, it's just the perfect hook, isn't it?
Right.
Because it illustrates the core advantage right away. We often think of air battles happening way up high, in the stratosphere. But on April 3rd, 1965, the environment just completely turned the U.S. advantage on its head. American pilots were expecting clear skies, good visibility as they attacked the critical Thanh Hoa Bridge, but they just weren't looking low enough.
That's really the heart of it, especially early on. While the American strike planes were cruising high, maybe, say, 15,000 feet where they felt pretty secure, the MiG-17s were operating down in the haze, the mud layer they called it.
Below 5,000 feet.
Oh yeah, sometimes way lower, even in 1,000 feet. They were basically invisible against the jungle canopy, and radar just saw ground clutter down there. So they'd pop up, attack a pair of Evolved F-80 Crusaders just as they were pulling out of their bombing run.
Wow.
And Lieutenant Phemin Ngoc Lan, who led that mission, he scored hits with his 23mm cannon before the Americans had even fully registered the threat was there.
The element of surprise was just total. And it introduces what we're calling the central theme here, the paradox of the obsolete interceptor. So let's unpack that paradox. Maybe start with the aircraft's specific design history.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. To really get the MiG-17, you have to know where it came from. It wasn't, a clean sheet design. It was a direct, pretty deep modernization of the older MiG-15, which everyone remembers from the Korean War.
Right, the MiG-15 was famous.
Very famous. But the Soviet goal here, it wasn't really about creating a supersonic fighter. It was more about fixing the big problem the MiG-15 had. Its tendency to pitch up, sometimes uncontrollably, at high transonic speeds, close to the sound barrier.
So it was fundamentally a stability upgrade then, not really pushing the performance envelope drastically.
Exactly. The key technical jump was in its wing. It was completely redesigned. The MiG-17 used a thinner wing profile and, crucially, a much greater sweep angle, 45 degrees, compared to the MiG-15's 35 degrees. It also had these things called leading-edge fences, sort of like vortex generators, which helped manage the airflow when the plane was pulling high angles of attack, turning hard. Now, what's really fascinating, and you touched on this, is that these huge aerodynamic improvements, they solved the pitch-up problem, they allowed for higher top speeds, but they did it without a single extra pound of thrust from the engine.
Really? Just aero changes.
Pure aerodynamic efficiency engineering. Quite clever, actually.
That is impressive. But, efficiency doesn't automatically mean it's a better fighter in all situations.
Yeah.
These design choices meant the MiG-17 was inherently limited in speed, right? It rarely went supersonic unless it was in a steep dive.
That's true. Its airframe tech was basically rooted in the late 40s, early 50s, post-World War II stuff.
So how did that limitation become its strength in Vietnam?
Well, that limitation is exactly what turned into its greatest strength in the specific context of Vietnam, because it was relatively light and had this big wing area for its weight, while that gave it very low wing loading.
Okay, low wing loading. What does that translate to for a pilot?
It means incredible maneuverability, especially at slower speeds and down low, at low altitudes. While these big, heavy U.S. fighter bombers like the F-4 Phantom, they were built for raw speed and high-altitude interception. They really struggled to maintain energy and turned sharply in the dense air down near the Red River Delta.
Wait a second, though. If the U.S. had faster planes, better radar, guided missiles, why did they even get drawn into these low-altitude dogfights where the MiG-17 was so good? Doesn't that kind of point to a flaw in U.S. tactics or doctrine at the time?
Oh, absolutely. It points directly to a doctrinal conflict and maybe some technological immaturity on the U.S. side back then. U.S. pilots were basically trained that superior speed and missiles, particularly standoff missiles, would keep them safe. Get in fast, shoot, get out.
But the missiles didn't always work as planned.
Exactly. Their early air-to-air missiles, things like the AM-9B Sidewinder, the Heat Seeker, or the radar-guided AM-7 Sparrow, they were notoriously unreliable, especially in the early days, and often pretty useless in that humid, close-in, high-G maneuvering fight.
Why useless?
Well, the missiles often failed to lock on properly, or they'd lose track, especially at short ranges or when the target was maneuvering hard against the ground clutter. The tech just wasn't quite there yet for that environment.
Okay, so the sophisticated missiles weren't the magic bullet they hoped for. That means U.S. pilots were effectively forced into a visual range, guns blazing kind of fight.
Which is precisely where the MiG-17 was deadly. Let's talk about those guns.
Yeah, the armament.
Its loadout was, well, it was a brute force approach compared to the intended finesse of U.S. missiles. The VPAF MiG-17s typically carried 3 really formidable cannon. One big Noodleman-Reiter 37mm cannon.
37mm. That's huge for a fighter cannon.
It is. It fired these heavy, high-explosive shells. If even a short burst from that hit an American fighter bomber, it often meant catastrophic damage, just tore chunks out of the airframe. And then it had 2 faster-firing 23mm Noodleman-Reiter cannons alongside it. They really prioritized hitting power.
And they stuck with the gun and rocket versions, right? Even though the Soviets did make a missile version, the MiG-17 PFU with K-5 missiles, why didn't Hanoi use those?
Yeah, the VPAF generally preferred the simplicity and, frankly, the reliability of the cannon-armed day fighters. Those early Soviet-guided missiles, much like the early American ones, were relatively primitive. They often required the pilot to basically fly straight and level after launch to guide the missile, or for the radar to maintain lock.
Which is the last thing you want to do in a dogfight.
Precisely. For a low-altitude interceptor, whose main advantage was its agility, its ability to turn and burn, those missile-equipped versions just didn't fit their tactical doctrine. They needed to get in fast, turn tight, unleash those powerful cannons, and then get out, often in visually confusing conditions.
Okay, that makes sense. Which brings us back to this whole obsolescence thing. By the mid-60s, the Soviet air forces themselves are moving on, getting supersonic MiG-21s. Why was this specific aging jet design so perfect for North Vietnam's situation?
Because the war North Vietnam was fighting wasn't the war the Soviets were planning for, a high-altitude clash over Europe. North Vietnam was fighting a defensive war, mostly against heavy fighter bombers lumbering in with huge bomb loads. These planes were relatively slow and predictable during their actual bombing runs.
Vulnerable.
Exactly. The MiG-17's specific maneuverability allowed VPAF pilots, if they timed their attack perfectly, to literally turn inside the turning circle of the much heavier U.S. aircraft. The F-4 Phantom, for instance, it often had to sacrifice a huge amount of altitude and speed just to try and follow a hard-maneuvering MiG-17. It would just bleed off all its combat energy. The MiG-17 didn't need to be faster overall, it just needed to be more agile in that critical moment, in that knife fight.
And crucially, Hanoi was very careful with its newer planes. They did get more advanced MiG-19s, which were supersonic, and the MiG-21s. But the MiG-17 pilots were the ones doing most of the heavy lifting, weren't they?
Absolutely. The MiG-21s, those were the capital assets, fast, modern for the time, radar-equipped. They were generally reserved for high-value targets like B-52s, or for the high-altitude defense of Hanoi itself. But the vast majority of U.S. sorties were these fighter bombers carrying bombs and rockets.
The workhorses.
The workhorses, exactly. And the VPAF leadership decided, quite strategically, that the cheaper, simpler, more agile MiG-17 was sufficient and perhaps more expendable to engage the bulk of these American strike aircraft. It was a tactical choice to maximize the use of this older jet where its specific characteristics gave it the best chance.
That reliance really puts the spotlight on the people flying them and the whole system they had to build basically from nothing. It sounds like a monumental challenge. So when the U.S. really started its sustained bombing campaigns, like Rolling Thunder, the VPAF, the North Vietnamese Air Force, was starting almost from zero, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What was the timeline like for actually getting pilots trained and jets in the air?
Yeah, the foundations were laid pretty quietly, actually. Back in the early 1960s, North Vietnam saw the writing on the wall, geopolitically. So in 1960, they sent their first batch of 52 aspiring pilots off to China and the Soviet Union.
52 pilots. That's not a lot to start an air force.
Not at all. And it was a long, intense training cycle. They spent 2 full years learning everything from basic jet handling, specifically on the MiG-17, to the complex tactics of air combat. These were carefully selected guys, and they started returning home around 1962.
And the actual planes, the hardware, followed a couple years later.
That's right. February 3rd, 1964, that's when Moscow delivered the first batch. 36 MiG-17s, along with some crucial MiG-15 trainers, which they needed to keep pilots proficient. These planes immediately formed the core of the very first fighter unit, the 921st Sao Du Fighter Regiment.
So they were operational by 64, but as you said, they faced enormous hurdles, logistically and geographically.
Oh, massive. The sources talk a lot about the air defense crisis they were in. They desperately needed effective radar, particularly automatic direction-finding radar as the war heated up. but the very geography of North Vietnam was working against them.
How so? The shape of the country.
Exactly. North Vietnam is long and skinny, especially down in the Panhandle, where in some places it narrows to only about 43 miles wide.
43 miles, that's nothing for a jet.
Practically nothing. It meant U.S. aircraft launching from bases in Thailand to the west, or from carriers out in the South China Sea to the east, had almost zero warning time before they were over critical targets. The moment U.S. jets crossed the border, bam, they were almost there.
So conventional radar placement was difficult.
Very difficult. The VPAF needed these heavy, quite sophisticated Soviet radar units like the P-12 series spoonrest radars to try and detect low-flying intruders and give their fighters some kind of vector, some direction to intercept.
But getting that kind of big, sensitive equipment into position through dense jungle, that sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was a monumental struggle. You have to picture this. It wasn't just driving trucks down highways. It often involved manually hauling heavy equipment, sometimes dismantling and reassembling bulky radar antennas in incredibly difficult remote jungle locations just to try and plug that 43-mile-wide detection gap.
And those radar sites themselves would become targets, surely?
Absolutely high-priority targets for U.S. strikes, which forced the VPAF into this constant cycle of moving them, camouflaging them, maintaining them under incredible pressure in the deep jungle. The end result was, inevitably, limited radar range and persistent gaps in their coverage.
So if the high-tech radar system was crippled by the terrain, the geography, the bombing, how did the VPAF even spot incoming American planes a lot of the time?
Well, they had to fall back on a surprisingly almost antiquated system, but it was essential. Ground observers. They deployed thousands of spotters across the country, literally people with binoculars, linked by telephone lines and radios, tasked with just reporting sightings of enemy aircraft.
Human intelligence, basically.
Exactly. And while this was useful for triggering general air raid warnings for the civilian population, it was, as the sources put it, far from foolproof for intercepting fighters. These reports were often slow, they were prone to errors in identification or location, and crucially, they usually couldn't provide the precise speed and heading information needed to scramble a jet interceptor effectively.
So a lot of the time, the MiG pilot is getting launched, maybe vectored vaguely towards a reported area, and then they're relying almost entirely on their own eyesight, just scanning the sky or the ground to find the targets.
That's a critical point. Facing fighters designed to fly at Mach 2, relying on the Mark 1 eyeball is a massive handicap. Without that reliable, real-time radar vectoring, the MiG-17 pilots were absolutely forced into ambush tactics. They had to use that element of surprise we talked about.
How did that work in practice?
They'd often sit low, maybe orbiting near a known target area, hidden in the ground clutter, waiting for the American strike force to actually commit to its bombing run. Then, they'd pop up quickly, hoping to see the U.S. planes silhouetted against the sky before they themselves were spotted. It was incredibly risky.
Yet, despite all these handicaps, they did manage an early morale booster, didn't they? That first claimed kill back in '64.
Yeah, it wasn't against a fighter, but it was symbolically very important. Their first claimed success came on February 16, 1964, literally just days after those first MiG-17s were officially delivered and declared operational. Radar crews managed to track an American C-123 provider.
A transport plane.
Right, a twin-engine transport, but a critical supply aircraft, especially over the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. They spotted it flying near the Laos border. The next morning, a VPAF jet scrambled, intercepted it, and claimed it shot down.
A small victory, but proof of concept. Still, the VPAF commanders, they must have been incredibly realistic about the huge gap they faced.
Oh, they were deeply sober about it. They knew they had just a handful of trained pilots, a small number of jets, and they were up against an enemy with what seemed like almost infinite resources by comparison. They absolutely accepted their technological inferiority.
Which meant tactics were everything.
Everything. There's even a story, perhaps apocryphal, but it shows the desperation, of one pilot reportedly suggesting they use suicide attacks, kamikaze style, just to try and overwhelm the American air armada and stop the bombing.
Wow. That really shows the pressure they felt. What was Hanoi's official response to that kind of extreme idea?
They completely rejected it. Hanoi's tactical doctrine was firmly focused on preserving their precious resources. They prioritized tactics that aimed for victory, even if victory just meant forcing the bombers to drop their bombs early and run, but always with the lowest possible loss of their own aircraft.
Because the MiGs, and especially those trained pilots, were just too valuable to waste.
Exactly. Too precious, too hard to replace. Their mission was about survival, deterrence, making the cost high for the U.S., not about achieving annihilation through reckless sacrifice.
Okay, so that commitment to tactical caution, to preservation, it was immediately put to the test in 1965, when the U.S. really escalated with Operation Rolling Thunder. Let's go back to that first major intercept mission we mentioned, April 3rd, 1965.
Right, that day was critical. The U.S. wasn't just hitting random targets, they were specifically going after key infrastructure. The main target was the Thanh Hoa Bridge, famously known as the Dragon's Jaw, a really vital railway and road bridge, a major transport bottleneck.
And the Americans sent in
Mostly Navy assets that day, initially F-8E Crusaders off the carriers, and later the Air Force would use F-105 Thunderchiefs. On April 3rd, VPAF radar operators tracked the American fighters hitting other targets first, like the Tau and Du Len bridges, before they converged on the main prize, the Thanh Hoa Bridge.
And this is where Lieutenant Pham Ngoc Lan and his wingman made their move, using that low-altitude advantage we talked about.
Correct. The VPAF scrambled 2 flights, 2 MiG-17s in each. Lan's flights specifically engaged the F-8 Crusaders. Flying low and fast, he managed to get into position and score sustained hits with his 23mm cannon on one of the F-8s. His wingman followed up, engaging a second F-8.
And the North Vietnamese immediately claimed kills.
They did. Their initial reports claimed 2 F-8Es shot down in that engagement.
But as often happens in air combat, the U.S. records tell a slightly different story.
Yes, this is a classic example of wartime claim discrepancies. U.S. Navy sources maintain that all 4 F-8Es involved in that specific flight returned safely to their carriers. However, they did acknowledge that one of the F-8Es was so badly damaged by the MiG's cannon fire.
From Lan's attack.
Presumably, yes. It was so badly damaged it couldn't make it back to the carrier and had to make an emergency landing at the U.S. Air Base in Da Nang, South Vietnam. So while a confirmed kill might be disputed between the two sides,
A tactical goal was achieved.
absolutely. The MiGs achieved their primary tactical goal. They disrupted the mission, they damaged a sophisticated U.S. fighter, and maybe most importantly, they sent a clear message that the skies over North Vietnam were contested territory. They weren't going to get a free ride.
But that initial success, it seems, was pretty short-lived. The sources paint a grim picture for the VPAF in the summer of 1965. A real trial by fire.
It was brutal. That summer, the young VPAF was almost, the word used is decimated in aerial battles. They were suddenly up against highly trained, very aggressive American pilots who were rapidly learning the MiG's tactics, adapting themselves, and the sheer numerical advantage of the U.S. was just overwhelming.
What did Hanoi attribute those heavy losses to?
Well, internally, they put it down to a few key factors. First, their own pilots' relative lack of sustained combat experience compared to the U.S. veterans. Second, the undeniable hardware inferiority of the MiG-17 against things like the F-4 Phantom and the F-105 Thunderchief in most performance areas, especially speed and acceleration. And third, critically, they blamed some overconfident local air defense units, maybe radar controllers who perhaps vectored the fighters too predictably or exposed them too early, losing that crucial element of surprise.
And you mentioned the raw statistics for 1965 were pretty stark. 156 scrambles, but only 15 claimed kills for the entire year.
Yeah, those numbers really stand out.
Hold on, only 15 kills out of 156 scrambles. Doesn't that actually kind of prove the point that the aircraft was obsolete? That the pilots, despite their training, were fundamentally outmatched most of the time?
That's a really important question, and the answer, I think, is a bit more nuanced than just looking at the kill ratio. On the surface, yeah, 15 for 156, that looks like a very core exchange rate.
It does.
But it actually demonstrates 2 key things, I believe. First, it just underscores the immense disparity in numbers. They were constantly scrambling against waves of incoming U.S. aircraft, often heavily outnumbered. Second, it highlights the VPF's likely very strict criteria for confirming a kill. They generally only recorded a victory if the American jet was visually confirmed crashing, maybe by the pilot or by ground observers.
Whereas their main goal wasn't always a kill.
Exactly. Their immediate, more frequent goal was often purely defensive: disrupt the strike package. If a flight of MiG-17s could force a formation of F-105 to jettison their heavy bomb load early and abort their attack run on a critical bridge or factory, that was considered a successful mission, a successful defense, even if no enemy aircraft were shot down. They were protecting vital infrastructure, not just racking up scores.
Okay, that makes sense. Protecting resources was the priority. And the U.S., of course, wasn't standing still. They adapted quickly to take away the MiG's main advantage, that element of surprise.
They did. The primary U.S. countermeasure, and it was a big one, was the rapid deployment of sophisticated airborne surveillance platforms. Specifically, they brought in the Lockheed EC-121D Warning Star.
The Big Willie planes?
That's them. These were huge, four-engine, propeller-driven aircraft, basically flying radar stations derived from the Constellation airliner. They'd orbit safely, far offshore or over Laos, and their powerful radars could look down and provide a comprehensive picture of the airspace over North Vietnam. Crucially, they could detect the low-flying MiGs almost as soon as they took off from their bases.
That immediately negated the whole low-level ambush tactic.
Pretty much stripped it away.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the U.S. strike packages had near real-time warning of MiG scrambling. It made every single VPAF sortie incredibly dangerous because the element of surprise was largely gone.
So, as the war dragged on into 1966 and 1967, and the U.S. bombing campaign expanded to hit industrial sites, power plants, transportation hubs around Hanoi and the port of Haiphong,
Right.
how did the VPF adapt their strategy given their limited resources and this increased U.S. surveillance?
They were forced into what you could call radical selectivity. With U.S. air raids happening constantly all across the country, targeting everything from bridges to factories, the VPAF simply didn't have the numbers, the fuel, or the pilots to respond to every single attack. It was impossible.
So they had to pick their battles very carefully.
Extremely carefully. They were forced into a dedicated point defense strategy. They had to concentrate the remaining highly valuable MiG-17s, and remember, they were losing them in combat on defending only the absolute most critical strategic targets.
Which were?
Primarily the capital city, Hanoi itself, and perhaps even more importantly, the intricate and absolutely vital system of irrigation and flood control dikes along the Red River Delta.
The dikes.
Yeah.
Why were they so critical?
Because a successful attack on those dikes, especially during the monsoon season, could cause catastrophic flooding across the agricultural heartland of North Vietnam. It could cripple food production, displace millions of people. It was an existential threat. So the MiG-17 really transitioned from being a general interceptor to becoming the ultimate home guard, the last line of defense for the nation's survival.
Wow. So the story of the MiG-17 is really one of constant adaptation, just trying to make the best of a really difficult, evolving situation. Now, this is where the MiG-17 story takes a really interesting, almost unexpected turn. It goes from being purely a defensive fighter and interceptor to taking on a completely different offensive role late in the war. Around 1971, the VPAF actually started training pilots in these old jets for ground attack missions.
That's right. Specifically, the 923rd Squadron was picked for this special mission. By 1971, the North Vietnamese leadership realized they needed aircraft capable of handling not just ground targets, but specifically maritime targets. Anti-shipping strikes.
Anti-shipping with MiG-17s.
Yeah, the thinking was that the nimble little MiG-17, which was proven to be very good at flying extremely low and fast over terrain, could potentially do the same over water. So they repurposed it, fitted it with bomb racks, usually for Soviet FAB-250 bombs, which are about 550 pounds.
Okay, but flying an aging, subsonic, cannon-equipped jet, even with bombs, against a modern U.S. Navy warship with missiles and advanced radar, that sounds almost suicidal.
It was extraordinarily risky, no doubt about it, but it actually paid off, at least in terms of shock value, and in one notable case, real tactical effectiveness. This whole effort culminated in one of the most dramatic, yet somehow often overlooked, naval engagements of the entire war. The Battle of Dong Hoi, which took place on April 19, 1972.
Okay, Dong Hoi, April 72, what was the target?
The target was a very powerful U.S. 7th Fleet task force operating off the coast of North Vietnam near the city of Dong Hoi. These ships were providing naval gunfire support and coordinating the massive airstrikes of the renewed bombing campaign, Operation Linebacker, which had just kicked off.
And what kind of firepower were these MiG-17s flying towards? What ships were in that U.S. task force?
We're talking serious naval hardware. The group included the guided missile cruiser USS Oklahoma City, which was the flagship, also the guided missile frigate USS Sterett, and at least two destroyers, the USS Lloyd-Thomas and the USS Higbee. These ships were absolutely bristling with modern radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, and importantly, surface-to-air missile systems like the Terrier and Tartar, designed specifically to shoot down attacking aircraft.
A very tough nut to crack.
Yeah.
And the sources say the MiG-17s attack alongside North Vietnamese torpedo boats. That suggests a coordinated attack, trying to overwhelm the defenses.
Absolutely. It seems to have been a multi-pronged, coordinated raid designed precisely to confuse and saturate the American naval defenses. While the torpedo boats made their high-speed runs, 3 VPAF MiG-17s came in flying incredibly low, hugging the waves to try and stay below the ship's radar detection envelopes. Their goal was simple: get in close, drop their bombs, cause damage and chaos, and get out.
And incredibly, one of those pilots actually scored a direct hit on a U.S. destroyer.
They did. Against all odds, one of the MiG-17 pilots managed to penetrate the defensive screen of the task force and scored a direct hit on the destroyer USS Higbee with one of those 550-pound bombs.
Where did it hit?
The reports indicate the bomb struck near the aft 5-inch gun mount. It didn't sink the ship, but it instantly knocked out the gun mount, caused significant damage, and started a substantial fire on board.
Were there casualties?
Thankfully, the reports say that specific gun mount compartment had been evacuated just moments before the hit because of an unrelated problem, a shell hang-up during firing. But the damage was severe enough that the Higbee was knocked out of action and had to withdraw from the battle area for repairs.
That must have sent shockwaves through the U.S. Navy. Being hit, and hit hard, by a supposedly obsolete MiG-17 that theoretically should never have even gotten close enough past their missile defenses.
It was a massive psychological blow, absolutely. And historically, this action is really significant. It marks the first time that American warships have been actively struck and damaged by enemy aerial attack since the end of World War II back in 1945.
Wow, since WWII.
Yeah. Now, the Americans did fight back. The guided missile frigate USS Sterett managed to successfully engage and shoot down one of the attacking MiGs with a Terrier surface-to-air missile. But the other MiGs apparently escaped. The point was made, even against the most sophisticated naval defenses of the era, low-level maneuvering, surprise, and sheer audacity could still yield results. The MiG-17 proved its worth yet again in a totally unexpected role.
So the MiG-17 was clearly still a very relevant frontline asset right into 1972. Even as Operation Linebacker brought the air war to its absolute peak intensity.
Oh, very much so. Operation Linebacker, which started in May 1972 in response to the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive, saw some of the largest and most intense aerial battles of the entire conflict. The U.S. threw everything they had into it. On the very first day alone, they launched over 400 sorties, hitting targets all over North Vietnam, particularly around Hai Duong, Lai Vu, Phu Luang key transportation and logistics hubs.
And how did the MiG-17s hold up in those massive air battles? Now, they were facing not just standard F-4 Phantoms, but also the newer F-4E variants, which had an internal cannon addressing one of the Phantom's earlier weaknesses.
Well, May 10th, 1972, the very first day of Linebacker, proved the old MiG-17 still had some teeth, even in that incredibly hostile environment. Records show that 4 MiG-17s from that same 923rd Squadron were scrambled specifically to defend the crucial bridgehead at Lai Vu.
And they were going up against
everything. U.S. Air Force and Navy F-4 Phantoms, Navy A-6 Intruders for all-weather bombing, A-7 Corsairs for ground attack, just waves of American air power. Despite those overwhelming numbers, the VPAF managed to put up a combined force that day of 4 of their precious MiG-21s and 7 MiG-17s.
Okay, a total of 11 MiGs against potentially hundreds of U.S. sorties. What was the outcome for that pivotal first day of Linebacker?
According to VPAF claims for that single day, May 10th, their combined MiG force succeeded in downing 2 U.S. Air Force F-4 Phantoms. And reports suggest the MiG-17s played a significant role, not just in trying for kills, but in disrupting the American attacks. By forcing the U.S. fighters to constantly break off their attack runs to engage the MiGs to defend themselves. In the high-stress, target-saturated environment of Linebacker, where every U.S. pilot was focused on getting their bombs on target and constantly checking their six for threats, the sudden appearance of a nimble, hard-turning MiG-17 right in their face remained a profound danger, forcing them to react defensively. It just solidified the idea that even late in the war, in close-quarters combat, the MiG-17's maneuverability was still a major factor.
Okay, so we've followed this remarkable aircraft from its initial deployment back in '64, through its main role as a defensive interceptor, all the way to these surprising late-war offensive missions like the Maritime Strike in '72. Let's try and sum it up. What does the final scorecard look like for the MiG-17 over its entire combat career in Vietnam, say from 1965 to the end of major U.S. involvement in 1972?
The overall statistics, when you put them together, are really the final testament to the MiG-17's unexpected tactical value. According to the official VPAF claims, their MiG-17 pilots were credited with a total of 71 aerial victories against a whole range of U.S. aircraft, everything from F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunderchiefs to Navy A-4 Skyhawks and F-8 Crusaders. 71 claimed kills.
71. Now, how does that compare to the U.S. claims for MiG-17 shot down?
That's where it gets really interesting. The Americans, across all services, claimed a total of 61 MiG-17s down during that same period, 1965 to 1972.
Wait, no, 71 claimed by the VPAF, 61 claimed by the U.S. That's almost a 1-to-1 exchange ratio. For an aircraft considered obsolete, flying against arguably the most technologically advanced air forces in the world at the time, how is that even possible? How do we explain that near parity?
That near parity, that almost 1.1 ratio, is probably the single most striking takeaway from this whole deep dive, isn't it? It implies several really important things. First, yes, we absolutely have to acknowledge the potential for, let's say, optimism or inflation in the VPAF's claimed victory numbers. That's pretty standard for all air forces in wartime reporting.
Sure, fog of war and propaganda.
Exactly. However, it also strongly highlights the very real systemic difficulties U.S. forces often had in definitively confirming their own MiG kills. Think about it. An F-4 pilot fires a heat-seeking Sidewinder missile at a MiG-17 that's jinking hard down low, maybe just a few hundred feet off the deck.
Right.
The missile hits, there's an explosion, but did the MiG actually crash? Did it go into the jungle? Did the pilot eject? Often the F-4 pilot or their wingman couldn't stick around to watch. They had to immediately braid off to avoid hitting the ground themselves, or evade another MiG, or deal with ground fire. Confirmation was genuinely difficult in that environment.
So, in essence, the American kill claims might actually be undercounted, precisely because the MiGs were operating in that low-altitude, high-speed, visually confusing environment that they exploited so well.
That's a very plausible interpretation, yes. That low-altitude realm was the MiG's sanctuary in many ways. So this near parity, even accounting for some claim inflation on both sides, really demonstrates powerfully that superior technology is only one part of the air combat equation. Pilot skill, effective training, intimate knowledge of a local environment, and crucially, exploiting the weaknesses in your enemy's doctrine.
Like the U.S. over-reliance on those unreliable early missiles and their initial neglect of close-in maneuvering combat training.
Exactly. All those factors ultimately helped to level the playing field far more than anyone expected.
And that skill component, it wasn't accidental, it was deliberately fostered. We really have to highlight some of the individual pilots who became legends flying these jets.
Oh, absolutely. The MiG-17, despite its limitations, produced multiple North Vietnamese aces pilots, credited with 5 or more confirmed victories. 2 names, in particular, consistently stand out in the records for their skill and success in the MiG-17, Lu Huichao and La Hai. Both of them were officially credited by the VPAF with 6 aerial combat victories each against American aircraft.
6 kills each in a MiG-17, that's incredible.
It really is. And their success wasn't just luck. It was the direct result of that intensive, highly focused training they received, primarily in Communist China and also the Soviet Union. Training that was specifically tailored for close range, visual combat, energy management, and gunnery, precisely the skills needed to succeed in the MiG-17, and skills that, ironically, the U.S. Air Force and Navy had initially de-emphasized in the early 1960s in favor of missile technology and high-speed intercepts.
A fascinating turnabout. So the MiG-17's main combat role effectively winds down with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, which ended direct U.S. military involvement. Did the VPF just park them or scrap them immediately after the ceasefire?
Not at all. In fact, they immediately put them back into strategic positions. The accords were signed on January 27, 1973. Within days, the VPAF began redeploying its assets. The 923rd Regiment, the main MiG-17 unit by then, moved its fleet down to the newly operational Tho Ran Air Base further south. But significantly, they kept at least 2 fully armed MiG-17s on constant alert status there, just in case the peace agreement broke down.
So still a frontline deterrent, even post-ceasefire.
Definitely. And a handful also remained stationed up at Kien En Air Base, near the crucial port city of Haiphong, specifically for defense there. The MiG-17 actually remained in frontline service with the unified Vietnamese Air Force until the late 1970s.
Wow, long after the American War ended, what was its role then?
Its primary role, post-1973, evolved completely away from air-to-air interception. The 923rd Regiment was formally redesignated solely for ground attack and maritime strike missions, basically capitalizing on those specialized skills they developed late in the war, like during the Dong Hoi raid. Eventually, as more modern Soviet aircraft, like later MiG-21 variants and MiG-23s, became available in larger numbers, the venerable old MiG-17 was finally relegated to a fighter-trainer role.
Teaching the new generation.
Exactly. Teaching new pilots the fundamental skills of jet aviation, basic maneuvering, maybe even some gunnery practice. The very last of these incredibly resilient jets were finally retired from VPAF service sometime in the early 1980s.
So, a combat career stretching across nearly 2 decades, right through the heart of the world's most intense air combat theater, all while being technically obsolete according to its designers almost from the start. It's just an amazing story of ingenuity in making the most of what you have. #tag outro. So the story of the MiG-17 in Vietnam, it's really far more than just an interesting historical footnote, isn't it? We started this deep dive asking, how did the supposedly obsolete aircraft somehow manage to challenge, even conquer, the skies at times? And the sources, I think, have given us some pretty clear answers. It boils down to asymmetry, smart resource management, and highly specialized training.
Yeah, it really wasn't about the aircraft being technically superior across the board. It couldn't compete in speed or altitude with an F-4, but it was all about its pilots maximizing its one singular crucial advantage, that incredible low-speed, low-altitude maneuverability within a very specific combat environment. North Vietnamese ingenuity, born from necessity, turned the MiG-17's limitations, like its slower speed and lack of good missiles, into tactical strengths. It allowed them to, as you said, literally and metaphorically turn inside their heavier, faster U.S. opponents, right where the fight was often decided down low and close in.
It really feels like the ultimate lesson in optimizing what you have, leveraging that local knowledge, that specific environmental advantage against overwhelming technological power. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather, they knew the limitations of their own plane, and they clearly studied the weaknesses in their enemy's hardware and doctrine, and they exploited every single crack they could find.
Indeed. This deep dive, I think, fundamentally demonstrates that superior technology on its own is not always the deciding factor in competition, whether it's military conflict or something else. Its agility, specific training, local expertise, and maybe just sheer determination could effectively challenge the most advanced aircraft of the 1960s. Well, it raises a really interesting question for you, the listener, to think about.
What crucial, maybe supposedly obsolete tool, or maybe a doctrine, or even just a type of local knowledge, might still hold an absolute competitive edge in a highly specialized modern environment today? Is there something out there that's being overlooked by the major players because they're too focused on the high-tech, high-speed, complex solutions? Just like the U.S. air power doctrine was perhaps in the early stages over Vietnam, think about the enduring power of the specialized underdog. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.